Welcome back, seekers of forgotten lore, to Eternal Olympus. Last time, we witnessed the most bizarre birth in history. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, sprang fully armed from the head of Zeus, which had been split open by Hephaestus. This miraculous birth was the result of Zeus swallowing his first love, the Titaness Leto, to gain her wisdom and avert a prophecy. Now, with wisdom internalized and a new favorite daughter at his side, Zeus's ever-wandering eye, the eye that caused all this trouble, has settled on a new, unsuspecting target. Wisdom, in the form of the consumed goddess Metis, may have been whispering, a new and constant rational voice, in one of Zeus's divine ears, but passion, hot, demanding, and utterly irrational, was always screaming in the other. The great, tumultuous double wedding feast of the Olympians, the celebration of his new stable cosmic order, had barely concluded. The last of the nectar had been drunk, the last notes of Apollo's lyre had faded, and the final, ecstatic plate had been smashed. His wife, Hera, was at last, he hoped, mollified. Her position as Queen of Heaven, now publicly and divinely ratified. His own splitting, agonizing, world-ending headache, which had turned out to be the most bizarre pregnancy in history, had resolved itself in the glorious, armor-clad birth of his new favorite daughter, Athena. Zeus, king of the gods, cloud-gatherer, lord of the firmament, sat on his throne, triumphant, complete, and utterly satisfied. And that, of course, is when the boredom returned. This was the curse of the supreme god, the same ennui that had plagued him after the Titanomachy. Absolute power, he was discovering, was a form of absolute stasis. The voice of Metis inside him counseled prudence, statecraft, the careful management of his new kingdom. She urged him to consider trade routes, the proper flow of rivers, the arbitration of disputes between distant nymphs. And for a time, he listened. He was, after all, Metieta, the wise counselor. But this internal wisdom did not, unfortunately, govern the entirety of his being. It did not govern his blood, his heart, or, most notoriously, his wandering eye. His passionate glance, which had already fallen once, briefly, during the chaotic revelry of his own wedding feast, now returned with a renewed predatory intensity to Leto. Leto was the demure daughter of the Titans Phoebe and Coeus. She was, in every way, the antithesis of his new wife. Where Hera was proud, imperious, demanding, and crackling with overt power, Leto was unshowy, modest, and possessed a quiet dignity. She was a beautiful nymph. Of course, all divine beings were, but hers was not the weaponized, overt, demanding beauty of Hera, nor the raw, elemental, catastrophic allure of Aphrodite. Hers was a gentle, unassuming loveliness, a demure quality that, for a god like Zeus who was weary of high drama and political marriages, was suddenly the most irresistible thing in the cosmos. There was, perhaps, another layer to his desire. Leto was a Titaness. She was the daughter of the very Titans, Phoebe and Coeus, who were at that very moment enjoying their freedom at the foot of Olympus, beneficiaries of Zeus's recent amnesty. To pursue Leto was not just an act of lust, it was a political statement. It was a reassertion of his dominance over the old order, a demonstration that even their pardoned, noble daughters were his for the taking. He was the king. Everything and everyone ultimately served his pleasure. He had chased her. It wasn't a question of if, only when. We do not know the details of the pursuit. Perhaps he came to her as a magnificent eagle, as he had with Ganymede. Perhaps he transformed himself into a gentle breeze, or a shower of gold. Or perhaps, for once, he came as himself, the radiant, charismatic king of gods, his beard crackling with charm, his eyes promising a devotion he had no intention of keeping. And Leto, an unshowy Titaness, a minor deity, in a court now ruled by her family's conqueror, was ultimately powerless. She was caught, as so many were, in the blinding headlights of his desire. Zeus, as he always did, had his way with her. For Hera, this was the final, unforgivable, ultimate insult. It was one thing for Zeus to have had his affairs before their grand public wedding. Those she could barely stomach as the indiscretions of a bachelor god. It was another thing entirely for him to have swallowed Metis, a bizarre premarital betrayal that resulted in a daughter literally bursting from his migraine-ridden skull. That had been a humiliation, a sidestepping of her own role as Divine Mother, but this was different. This was visceral. This affair with Leto had happened after the vows were sworn, after the hymns were sung, after she had stood before all creation and accepted him as her husband, king, and lord. And then, just as the bitter taste of this fresh betrayal was settling in, Hera learned that Leto was pregnant. The news, perhaps delivered by a spiteful, gossiping nymph, or perhaps whispered to her by one of her loyal peacock spies, struck Hera with the force of a physical blow. Her rage was not the hot, screaming, reactive rage of the Golden Throne incident. This was a cold, deep, geological fury. This was the calculating, remorseless anger of a queen whose authority had been publicly flouted. It was the humiliation of Athena's birth all over again, but worse. Athena, at least, was the child of Metis, a goddess of some standing, of wisdom. This was just another tawdry affair, another bastard godling, or as her instincts shrieked at her, godlings, plural. On the way to challenge the legitimacy of her own true-born children, the malformed Hephaestus and the oafish Ares. Hera, who saw herself as the true architect of the Olympian dynasty, the protector of bloodlines, legacy, and the sacred institution of marriage, saw Leto's pregnancy as a direct existential threat to the very order she had fought so hard to establish. It was a mockery of her domain, of her crown. She vowed, with a coldness that terrified even herself, that this child or children would never be born. Hera acted not with the impulsive violence of her husband, but with the cold, remorseless calculation of cosmic law. She did not strike Leto directly with a lightning bolt. That was Zeus's crude method, and besides, Leto now carried Zeus's own seed. No, Hera's revenge would be more subtle, more agonizing, and far more complete. She went to an older, deeper power. She descended from the glittering newness of Olympus down to the dark, primal earth. She called upon her own grandmother, Gaia. She found the Earth Mother brooding, her great form merged with the hills and valleys. Hera, Queen of Heaven, stood before the primordial mother and made her demand. She commanded Gaia, as a descendant, as the new ruler of the heavens, to deny Leto any land on which to give birth. She placed a curse, a formal edict, binding and absolute. No place on the face of the earth, no island, no continent, no patch of soil rooted to the ground, no cave, no mountain, no field, would ever offer sanctuary to the pregnant Titaness. Gaia, perhaps still bitter from her own ancient sorrows of children imprisoned within her, or perhaps simply bound by the inescapable laws of divine hierarchy to obey the new Queen of Heaven, agreed. The entire planet, the very rock and soil of existence, became a hostile, active entity, unified in its rejection of Leto. The curse was set. Thus began one of the most desperate, agonizing wanderings in all of mythology. Poor, pregnant Leto, her belly swelling with the divine seed of Zeus, found herself a universal outcast. She began to walk. She tried to find shelter in the wild lands of Thrace, But the moment her foot touched the soil, the ground itself would tremble and recoil, as if from a pestilence. She tried to rest in the forests, but the trees, children of Gaia, would rustle their leaves in terror and shake her from their shade. She journeyed to the mystical lands of the Hyperboreans, who dwelt, it was said, in a land of eternal spring beyond the north wind. They were a kind and gentle people. They saw her distress, her advanced pregnancy, and they pitied her. They offered her food and a place to rest. But as she sat, the ground of their sacred land began to shake. Their crops began to wither. The Hyperboreans, terrified that Hera's curse would destroy their paradise, respectfully but firmly asked her to leave. She was driven south, across the rocky plains of Asia Minor. She wandered from city to city, from village to village, a goddess reduced to the status of a beggar. But the curse preceded her. Mortals, farmers, and fishermen could sense the wrongness around her. They saw her, a goddess in obvious distress, her divine nature unmistakable. But they also felt the anger of the earth beneath their feet, fearing that Hera's wrath would blight their crops and sour their milk. They drove her away, throwing stones and shouting curses, not from malice, but from pure, superstitious terror. She was an abomination, a walking plague, and no one dared offer her shelter. She was utterly alone, wandering a world that had become her personal prison. The physical agony of her journey was immense. She was carrying twins, and they were divine twins, fathered by the king of the gods. They grew heavy within her, draining her strength. Her feet bled, her body ached, and the exhaustion was all-consuming. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological torture. She was friendless, hunted, and hopeless, with no end to her suffering in sight. In her absolute despair, Leto cast her prayers up to the sky, the domain of the very god who had caused her suffering. "Zeus," she cried, her voice cracking, "Father of my children, you who swore to protect me, where are you? Have you abandoned me to your wife's petty cruelties? Is this your justice? Is this your love?" Zeus heard her. From his throne on Olympus, he heard every sob, every plea. But for all his power, he was constrained. This was Hera's edict, enacted within her own sacred domain of marriage and family. And worse, it was being enforced by Gaia, a power older and more fundamental than his own. To simply countermand Hera's curse would be an act of outright tyranny, a violation of the very divine laws he had sworn to uphold. It would be a constitutional crisis on Olympus, proof that he was no better than his father, Kronos. It would, perhaps, have given his ambitious brother Poseidon the very excuse he needed to challenge his rule. He could not, or would not, simply undo the spell. But he could find a loophole. The wisdom of Metis, swirling within him, must have urged a cleverer, more subtle solution than a direct confrontation. The curse, Hera's curse, was specific. It forbade any land rooted to the earth from giving Leto shelter. The key word was rooted. Zeus needed to find a place that was not fixed, not part of Gaia's domain. He turned to his brother, Poseidon. He didn't command him. He called upon him, reminded him of their alliance, their shared victory. Perhaps he reminded Poseidon of the good fortune he'd had in drawing the lot for the sea, while Hades was stuck in the gloom. Perhaps he promised future favors, dominion over new islands. Poseidon, who had little love for Hera and her rigid propriety, and who probably relished the chance to subversively undermine his sister-wife's authority, agreed. He, master of all things that float, knew just the place. There was a small, uninhabited, rocky island that drifted aimlessly in the eddies of the Cyclades. It was a barren, useless piece of rock, unanchored to the seabed, constantly moving. It was named Delos because it was not rooted, because it was technically part of Poseidon's domain and not Gaia's. It was the one place in the cosmos immune from Hera's curse. Zeus guided Leto, some say by sending Hermes. Others say by having Poseidon create a great upswell of waves to guide her small, desperate boat to this tiny floating rock. It was desolate, windswept, and offered no comfort. It was a granite speck in a vast sea, but it was sanctuary. Poseidon, it is said, seeing her agony, took pity and momentarily anchored the floating island with 4 great pillars, giving it stability for the ordeal to come. Exhausted, broken, Leto made her landfall on Delos. With the last of her strength, she crawled up the barren shore, finding meager shelter beneath a single straggling pine tree near the island's low peak, Mount Synthos. She subsisted for a month on what little she could find: some wild fruits, some seeds, her belly swelling to a terrifying size. She feared she was carrying monsters like her grandmother Gaia had. Then, the labor pains began. They were unlike any suffering she had yet known. They were agonizing, beyond any mortal comprehension. A divine body being torn apart. And she was alone. Hera, from her throne on Olympus, watched. And in her cold, calculating fury, she played her final card. She had forbidden Aethea, the goddess of childbirth, from attending Leto. She held the goddess of delivery hostage on Olympus, refusing to let her go. For 9 days and 9 nights, the stories say, Leto was in agonizing, fruitless labor. The other goddesses on Olympus, Demeter, Hestia, even Aphrodite, heard her screams echoing across the sea. They pitied her, but they dared not cross Hera, whose jealous rage now held all of heaven in its grip. Finally, they could bear it no longer. They devised a plan, sending Iris, the rainbow messenger, to secretly fetch Aethea while Hera was distracted, bribing her with a magnificent necklace of gold and amber. Aethea, freed from Hera's grasp, rushed down to Delos. The moment she set foot on the island, the birth commenced. On the 10th day, the first child was born. It was a girl. The most lovely baby yet, strong, with an astonishing silvery quickness and a supple, powerful strength. Leto, gasping with relief and pain, named her Artemis. But the ordeal was not over. Leto's instincts had been right. There was another child, a twin, still inside her. And this younger twin was lodged sideways, breech, stuck in the birth canal, causing Leto a pain that threatened to tear her immortal body apart. Artemis, this infant girl, not 5 minutes old, strong and astonishingly preternaturally aware, found herself put to immediate, miraculous work. She already possessed her divine, instinctive sense of purpose. As her mother screamed in what she thought was her final agony, Artemis, the newborn, assisted with the birth of her own glorious twin brother. She became, in the very first moments of her own life, a midwife, her tiny divine hands guiding her brother into the world. With Artemis's divine assistance, the boy was born. Mother and daughter cried out in joyful surprise. For the hair on his head was not jet black like his sister's or his mother's. It was blonde, a brilliant shining gold, an inheritance from his maternal grandmother, the shining Titaness Phoebe. He was radiant, glowing with a golden beauty that lit up the barren island, momentarily eclipsing the sun. Leto named the child Apollo, Delian Apollo. He would be called in honor of his birthplace. And Phoebus Apollo, in deference to his grandmother and his own radiant golden beauty, for Phoebus means shining one. There, on the floating desolate rock of Delos, shunned by the earth and cursed by the Queen of Heaven, The two brightest, most beautiful, and most complex of the Olympian gods had finally entered the world. The island, having served its sacred purpose, was said to have been fixed forever to the seabed by Zeus, becoming a holy sanctuary. But Leto, exhausted, clutched her two perfect divine children, knowing that while this battle was over, Hera's war against them had only just begun. Artemis and Apollo, the divine twins of prophecy, music, and the hunt, are born. But they are born into a world where the Queen of Heaven is their sworn enemy. How will Zeus protect these new, powerful children from Hera's unabated wrath? And what gifts will a grateful father bestow upon his new favorites? Join us next time on Eternal Olympus as Artemis makes her famous wish list, and Apollo, still just an infant, must face his first terrifying monster, the Great Python of Delphi. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and journey with us again into the mists of myth.